Thank you very much. Today we are going to look at the cardiovascular system. And we talk about the cardiovascular system. We're looking at blood, the heart, as well as the blood vessels. The blood is just a fluid that carries the material from one tissue to the other. But the main organ, which is the heart, is the driving force or the pump that pumps this blood to all parts of the body. Yes, of course, must follow through a channel to get to those tissues. So these are the blood vessels. So the heart pumps blood through the blood vessels to other parts of the body. So we're talking about the cardiovascular system. Definitely, it's going to be the blood, the heart, and the blood vessels. Let's look at the blood. The blood is classified as a connective tissue, even though some books will say it is a false connective tissue or it's a pseudo connective tissue because one, the matrix of blood is not solid or semi-solid like cartilages and others and bone, but because the matrix is liquid, that is why it is classified as a false connective tissue. It's a connective tissue because it's made up of cells. So we'll talk about the cells. Blood is a thick fluid, but it varies in color from individual to individual because we all don't have the same oxygen concentration. So the carrying capacity of oxygen in the blood will determine the color of your blood, either from brick red to dark red. Ideally, when you want to measure the quantity of blood in a human being, it will vary because of different weights and sizes. But when you take a 70-kilogram man, he should have about 5 to 6 liters of blood, and that accounts about 8% of the total body weight. So this is a pictorial diagram of blood that has been centrifuged or it has been left to settle, but I think we'll talk much about this in the subsequent slides. So let's look at the functions of blood. The functions of blood. The first function we need to talk about is transportation, to transport substances from one place to the other. So when you look at what are these substances that are being transported, now we have oxygen, we have nutrients or food substances, we have wastes as well as hormones. So if you are talking about the transportation function of blood, it transports oxygen to all tissues. It carries waste from all tissues to the kidney for it to be removed. It carries hormones from the site of production to the target organ for functioning. It also carries nutrients. That is when the digestive system is able to digest the food and convert them to the final product. It is carried, the blood carries this final product to where they are needed. The second function of blood we want to talk about is the regulation function of blood. Now, the blood is capable of keeping the pH of the body to about 7.4. So the blood has its own way by which it's able to regulate such that the pH of the body will be 7.4 on the average. It also, the blood has the ability to also regulate fluid in the tissue. Yes, of course, there is an albumin in blood that is able to make sure that fluid is regulated so that you don't become edematous or you don't become puffy. So that's the regulation function. And also, blood has the ability to regulate body temperature. Protective function of blood. That's the third function of blood. Protection. Blood has white blood cells that also has different types of white blood cells. And the main function is that blood will carry these blood cells to where offenders or where pathogens or microorganisms are so that they will fight against these pathogens. It also contains some fibrinogen, some prothrombin, that when you have a cut, it's able to protect you so that you won't lose a lot of blood by forming a clot. Now, when you take the composition of blood, blood is made up of two primary elements. We have the liquid portion, that is the plasma, and we also have the cells, that is the form elements or the corpuscles. So, with the blood cells, which is the solid part, we have three of them. We have the erythrocytes, the leukocytes, and platelets. The erythrocytes are the red blood cells, the leukocytes are the white blood cells, and the platelets are the thrombocytes. The platelets are the thrombocytes. So the function of the red blood cells is just to transport oxygen because it contains an element there called hemoglobin that is capable of binding to oxygen and transporting it to tissues and other cells. The leukocytes looks white, but some books say that they are colorless, and their function is to protect you against infection. So they are the body defense mechanism. Then the platelets, which are also known as the thrombocytes, are just cell fragments, and they assist in clotting. Blood clotting. Now let's talk about the plasma, the blood plasma. The blood plasma is about 90% of water and 10% dissolved substances. There are also proteins in the plasma called the plasma proteins. The plasma proteins. So what are plasma proteins? Plasma proteins vary. Some books have more than four as they have been listed here. So what are they? Albumin is one of them. Antibodies, one of them. Clotting factors, like example is the fibrinogen, is one of them. And then there are also globulins. And all these have different functions as it has been stated. So the albumin ensures that there is osmotic pressure, and that's to make sure that it maintains fluid in the body. The antibodies is to combat infection, and then fibrinogen is to make sure that there is clotting when you have a cut and other functions. So this is what I was talking about. This is a diagram of a centrifuge blood, or blood that has been allowed to settle. So when the blood settles, we have two primary elements. That is the plasma, that is made up of 55%, and formed element, or the blood cells, that's made up of 45%. Now the plasma, as we said, contains about 90% of water and 10% of dissolved substances. And for the formed element, or the cells, we have the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets, which we have talked about. Now there are some nutrients found in the plasma. And the first one we're going to talk about is the glucose. And glucose is basically from the carbohydrate that we eat. After digestion of carbohydrate, is glucose that is formed. Now, glucose can be stored in the liver in the form of glycogen. The second nutrient that is found in plasma is the amino acids, and definitely that is the end product of protein digestion, and they are also found in the plasma. There are also lipids or fats. There's a small percentage in the blood vessels, the blood plasma too as well. And yes, of course, we have mineral salts, and they appear in the form of chloride, carbonate, phosphates, potassium, magnesium, and other minerals. So these are the form elements that we're talking about: the erythrocyte, leukocytes, and platelets. Now let's take the erythrocytes. The erythrocytes, as I said, are also the red blood cells. What are they? They are very tiny, and they are disc shaped with a central area that is thinner than the edges. They have no nucleus, so they are anuclei. And of course, they have a lifespan of 120 days, average lifespan of 120 days. So the one main purpose of the red blood cells is to carry oxygen, because it contains a substance known as hemoglobin that have affinity for oxygen, so that blood can carry this oxygen to other parts of the body. So this is the structure of the red blood cells, the erythrocytes. So you'll see that it is biconcave disc. So that is the structure of the red blood cell. Now let's move on to leukocytes, which are the white blood cells. They vary in appearance, in quantity, and function as compared to the red blood cells. The red blood cells is anuclei, but white blood cells have nucleus. And unlike the red blood cells that have a particular shape, biconcave disc, the white blood cells, because of the numerous nature of them, they vary in sizes as well as shape. They are round and may not have a definite color. Some books will say they are white, but others will say they are colorless. So that is the white blood cell. When you take the white blood cell, the types, they are categorized into two. We have the granulocytes and then the agranulocytes. The granulocytes is just that they have granules within the cell, and the agranulocytes means that they don't have granules, grains in their cells. So when you look at the granulocytes, we have the neutrophil, the eosinophils, as well as the basophils, that are the granulocytes that contain granules in them. And when you talk about the agranulocytes, we have the lymphocytes as well as the monocytes. But yes, of course, the lymphocytes, we have the T lymphocytes and we have the B lymphocytes. Platelets or thrombocytes, they are the smallest of all the formed elements of the cells. Basically, they are functionally blood clotting cells. So when there is an injury and blood comes into contact with any of the tissues or the lining of the blood vessels as well as oxygen, a thick block is formed to make sure that it seals the area so that the person does not bleed to death. So there's a mechanism of blood clotting, which we have the procoagulant as well as the anticoagulant. There are also chemicals within the circulation that can dissolve clots. Under normal circumstances, the substance that prevents clotting prevails. However, when an injury occurs, the procoagulants are activated and a clot is formed. So when you look at the mechanism of blood clotting, very, very important, because if you should have a cut and this blood clotting mechanism fails, it means that you're going to bleed and bleed and bleed till you die. But God in his own wisdom has put a mechanism that makes sure that when you get a cut, you should be able, or the body should be able to activate this mechanism to ensure that bleeding stops. So the first thing is that the injured area or tissue releases a substance known as thromboplastin. And it's the thromboplastin that will trigger the clotting mechanism. What happens is the thromboplastin will react with certain protein factors and calcium ions to form prothrombin. So from thromboplastin to prothrombin, which in turn react with calcium ions. So the calcium ions will now convert the prothrombin to thrombin. Now thrombin in turn converts a soluble fibrinogen into fibrin, which is insoluble. Now the fibrin will now form a network thread that traps red blood cells and platelets to form that clot. That is the simple mechanism, even though complicated at this, but this is the mechanism. Now, blood type